Welcome to Faithful Election Conversations 2021. My name is John Malloy. I'm the director of the Center for Public Ethics at Martin Luther University College in Waterloo, Ontario. We are federated with Wilfrid Laurier University. Now, both Luther and Wilfrid Laurier are located on the Haldimand Tract, traditional territory of the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. This land is part of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples and symbolizes the agreement to share, protect our resources, and not engage in conflict. Today, this gathering place is home to many First Nations, Métis, and Indigenous peoples. Indeed, our Waterloo and Brantford campuses are located in the heart of southwestern Ontario. Both communities have large Indigenous populations in the Six Nations of the Grand River, and Mississauga of the New Credit First Nations are only a short drive from our Brantford campus. I know that we have people joining us from across Canada today for this important conversation, and we thank all those who took a moment when they registered to identify and acknowledge the Indigenous lands where you reside, and we encourage everyone to take steps to honor and respect Canada's First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and recognize their role as traditional stewards of the lands and water in which we reside. On September 20th, Canadians will be going to the polls for a federal election. Canada's faith communities are committed to supporting and encouraging the practice of responsible citizenship by asking their members to raise important issues during this campaign, both within their faith communities as well as with candidates and political parties. To that end, the Center for Public Ethics was delighted to join with a number of key partners to host today's forum, which will allow us to pose important questions to party representatives and give you a chance to assess the position of each party. And I want to acknowledge the strong support of these partners, the Baha'i Community of Canada, Centre Oblat, A Voice for Justice, and Citizens for Public Justice. I would also like to mention other partners who were kind enough to help us publicize the event: the Canadian Interfaith Conversation, the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, the National Alliance for the Advancement of Pluralistic Societies, the Toronto Interfaith Council, Interfaith Grand River, and Faith Climate Justice, among others. Although we're pleased to welcome many viewers to today's event, this is by no means the end of the process. Today's forum will be recorded and circulated to faith communities across Canada and beyond for their use as they engage in discussion about the upcoming election. I also want to thank our four candidates for taking time out of their busy schedules to attend this session. Some of you might be aware of the All-Party Parliamentary Interfaith Caucus that brings together MPs of all political stripes to promote dialogue between parliamentarians and members of Canada's religious communities, and I'm pleased to report strong support from all four parties for this initiative. Although there is a long list of issues of importance to people of faith, we have identified four of the most pressing: Indigenous reconciliation, climate justice, poverty, and xenophobia, including racial and religious intolerance. Over the course of the next 90 minutes, we will hear very brief presentations on these issues from leading experts in the field, as well as a response of the four main parties. Once we've explored all four key issues, as time permits, we will open the floor to questions from viewers, which you can post through the Q&A function at the bottom of the webinar screen. As we expect this to be a full discussion of the four key issues, we will try to deal with as many questions as time permits, but may not be able to get to all of them. Once again, thank you for joining us for this special event. As mentioned earlier, we will be making a recording of it available and encourage you to circulate it widely to members of your faith community and beyond, as all of us continue to engage in deliberation around the federal election. I'd now like to turn the floor over to Sirisha Iyer, the Executive Director of the organization Leading in Color, who has kindly agreed to serve as today's moderator. Sirisha.
Thanks, John. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for today's town hall. Before we begin, just some quick housekeeping. As John mentioned, the Q&A box is located at the bottom of your screen on the right-hand side of the toolbar and is available for you to submit questions throughout the event. We'll do our best to go through them, but may not be able to get to everybody's question, but we will do our best. Please also note that the statements from experts that have been provided have been pre-taped for this event. And finally, just a reminder to our candidates that you will each only have 3 minutes to respond to every question, and I'll provide you with some time signals, both physically and through the chat to help you out there. With that said, I'm so happy to welcome and introduce 4 candidates who are running for re-election. First, representing the Green Party, we have Elizabeth May, former Green Party leader running for re-election in Saanich Gulf Islands. Representing the Conservative Party, we have Garnett Genuis running for re-election in Sherwood Park and Fort Saskatchewan. Third, we have representing the Liberal Party, John McKay, who is running for re-election in the riding of Scarborough-Guildwood. And finally, representing the New Democratic Party and running for re-election in the riding of Timmins-James Bay is Charlie Angus. Thank you so much to all 4 of you for joining us today. We really appreciate it and are excited to hear what you have to share with us. Our first topic that we'll be delving into, as John mentioned, is Indigenous Reconciliation. And we'll hear from Niigan Sinclair, who is a commentator on Indigenous issues at the University of Manitoba, being interviewed by Joel Gordon, the Director of Partnership and Ministry Innovation. So I'll pass the floor over to the recording of Niigan.
Hello, good day. My name is Joel Gordon, and I'm speaking to you today, sharing with you from Williams Treaty Territory, which is traditional homelands of the Huron-Wendat, and the community that I'm currently in is also known as Stouffville. And I'm the Director of Partnership and Ministry Innovation at the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada, also known as the EFC. And joining me today to answer some questions and to share some insights about reconciliation with Indigenous peoples is Niigan, who will introduce himself now.
Great. Yeah. So bonjour nidmai magraduk, Niigan Webedim Nadijna Kos, Namagoshin Dodem. My name is Niigan Sinclair. I'm an associate professor at the University of Manitoba, a columnist with the Winnipeg Free Press, and I'm on the power panel on CBC on Fridays at 4:30. So there's the first issue, which is really talking about what do we do with this kind of toxic relationship, which bleeds into everything. Consultation on resource projects involves into the economy, the use of the economy, the way we co-govern spaces or govern spaces or make decisions on those major policy platforms. So we've got this very toxic relationship, and that's an important thing on the agenda. But the other thing that's the most important is we have a lot of emergency situations that have been created over, it really doesn't matter what federal government is in power, the Liberals or the Conservatives. We have the issue of boil water advisories, poverty, suicide epidemics, youth in prisons, the huge issue of murder missing Indigenous women and girls. And so we have these emergency situations throughout the country, which consecutive federal governments refuse to deal with. And so a federal government always has to deal with that, or what happens is they deal with it in a more reactive way than a proactive way, which just then expounds the problem, continues to build the problem up.
Now, what would you say, what 3 things would you like Canada's next government to do to advance the process of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples? You've already started to build on it, but yeah, I'd love to hear more.
Yeah, well, the key issue here is the environment. The environment is the most important issue for all of us going forward. And for Indigenous peoples particularly, as I often say, when we're in the lodge, when we're doing ceremonies and we sing a bear song, right, to honor our relationship with the bears, to think about how we can build on that relationship with the bears, to recognize the contributions the bears make to our life, and then hope into the future. That's really what those songs are all about. Why would you sing a bear song if there's no bears? And that's the challenge, is that we are not environmentalists. Indigenous peoples are not environmentalists. We, if anything, are lifeists. We are beings who want as much life as possible. We want to have an environment that's sustainable, ecologically reciprocal, and probably most important of all is the environment is our kin. That leads to the second issue, which is the issue of Indigenous rights. Indigenous rights is a constitutional obligation this country has within Section 35 of the Constitution. But most importantly, Indigenous rights is best for everybody, which leads to the third point, which is how do we create a peaceful country that will stop the violent suppression and oppression of Indigenous peoples, the denial of Indigenous peoples in government? How do we co-govern spaces? How do we recognize that Indigenous governments are as valid, if not more so, than the Canadian government itself? And so how do we begin to encapsulate and reconcile that? That's what reconciliation is. That's what reconciliation should be. And hopefully we can see more of that into the future, because right now you see almost none of it. You see maybe a few drops here and there of reconciliation in moments throughout the country, but the hope is that reconciliation will be something for everyone and it will benefit everyone. But most importantly, it must include and invite and be Indigenous led.
And we'll start off with the first response from the Liberal Party from John McKay.
I was rather hoping that it was not going to be me, because what Mr. Sinclair had to say was quite profound and quite disturbing. And so I'm not going to go to talking points, and I'm hoping that this conversation is not talking points. We are in an environment of reckoning that had been postponed for 150 years. And this environment has did what I would say, to use his phrase, a toxic relationship that needs to be addressed, in part because the various Indigenous nations don't see the world in the same lens as do non-Indigenous folks. And I frankly take at face value the desire and wish of the Prime Minister and the Liberal caucus to bridge that relationship. I'm somewhat frustrated that we've not made as much progress as any of us would have liked, and that some of the issues that were outstanding in years past are still outstanding. And I honestly, I don't know what the path forward is. I do think that there is a will on the part of the non-Indigenous population to move, and I believe the Indigenous population as well. One thing I would point to, which I thought was actually a constructive response, and that was in the part of the Public Safety Committee that I chaired, and we did a study on racism and policing, and of course we had a number of Indigenous representatives on the who made presentations. I thought that out of there was quite a number of recommendations, 42 recommendations, and a number of them I thought were actually real concrete steps forward to mitigate some of the more egregious elements of racism in policing, both conscious and unconscious racism in policing. And I felt quite pleased that all of the parties came together. There were supplementary reports, but by and large, it was a majority report. So that was one thing that took about 18 months to complete. So with that, I'm just going to say it flat out. I'm not very pleased with the progress that we are making, and we are in a state of reckoning. And I don't know whether reckoning will lead to reconciliation or whether it won't. But we are on this path together.
Thank you, John. Perfect timing as well. Over to Garnett.
Well, thank you. And I want to just acknowledge that my home and my riding are on Treaty 6 territory, traditional meeting grounds, and a traveling route for the Cree, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Métis, Dene, and Nakota Sioux. Friends, this is such a critically important topic. And I think we need to correctly situate the challenge we face in terms of the politics around Indigenous issues. We don't have a problem of good intentions. Everybody in the House of Commons recognizes the grave problems and wants to find solutions. So I think one important step is, not getting distracted by beating each other up over whether we care or don't care. We all care, but the solutions in terms of how we move forward in a way that is just and effective have eluded successive governments. And there's still much constructive debate that needs to happen about what particular policies are the best way forward. I want to just encourage folks to look at the Conservative platform in terms of Indigenous issues. I'll highlight some of those points in what I have to say. And I'll say folks who may not have been conservatives in the past may actually be surprised by some of the things that are in the platform, whether it's on Indigenous issues, labor rights issues, other kinds of issues. It's worth taking a look at the conservative platform, even if you haven't been someone who looks at conservatives before, because you might think, wow, that's interesting. That doesn't conform with my my stereotypes or my pre-existing perceptions. And you can find that at conservative.ca/plan. Our plan includes putting significantly more resources into education and investigation around grave sites, creating a national memorial for residential school survivors, recognizing safe drinking water as a fundamental human right, and ending long-term boil water advisories. Our plan puts a major emphasis on economic development and on self-determination for Indigenous communities. Some Indigenous communities choose to develop their resources in various ways. Some Indigenous communities choose not to develop their resources in various ways. And I think one of the criticisms that we have of the government is that they put more and more roadblocks in front of some of those communities that are making choices to encourage various kinds of economic development. We have long-running structures of paternalism that hurt self-determination and therefore also undermine economic development. We are committed in the platform to creating a national Indigenous Opportunities Corporation, the Canadian Indigenous Opportunities Corporation, that will put $5 billion of investment into Indigenous-led projects. This will include training and apprenticeships, developing an Indigenous business mentorship program, and expanding rural broadband access, as well as setting targets for government procurement from Indigenous businesses. So economic development, self-determination, these are key pieces of the puzzle in addition to the other points I mentioned. Thanks very much.
Thank you. And on to Charlie.
Thank you very much, Charlie Angus, Niigan Sinclair, here in Treaty 9 territory. I think we have to start at basics right now. And one of the basic truths that Canadians are learning, and it's a hard truth, is that there is no reconciliation without justice. And talking with many of the leaders who've been working on the Indigenous graves from the residential schools, that the need to address these crimes is fundamental. It's not about the historic wrongs, it's about the ongoing trauma that's happening in communities. If you map out the suicide crisis in Northern Canada, you will map out the communities that were affected by the predator priests. Where there was abuse, that long-standing damage in the communities is ongoing. And so we need justice for that. On this, we need to look at a much larger reframing of Canada's role and the church's role in the attempted destruction of the Indigenous family. Because we're not talking about historic wrongs, we're talking about today. The fact that the Trudeau government has been found guilty of systemic, willful and reckless discrimination against Indigenous children, 19 non-compliance orders, millions of dollars spent on lawyers. So what are we talking about? We're talking about children in Wapakika Reserve, for example, who died in the suicide crisis when the government wouldn't enact Jordan's principle. They died on our watch. We're talking about children who are still being taken from their families. I was talking with community leaders yesterday. They're being taken from their communities. They're being taken from their culture. They're being put into group homes in Southern Ontario, far from their lands, far from their identity. We have to address the fundamental breakdown in the child welfare system and end those court battles. We still have systemic underfunding in First Nation education on reserve. We can't get ahead until we recognize the incredible power of this young generation if we give them the tools. I was in Neskantaga just a couple of weeks ago, 26 and a half years without clean water. It's not rocket science fixing water. They actually have a water plant there. The government's never bothered to finish it. That negligence has to stop. We have to guarantee these as fundamental human rights. And I have to also call out the church. You know, the church doesn't get to talk reconciliation when it's still refusing to apologize. I know the Oblate Center and my good friend Joe Gunn's here, but the Oblate Order, we're responsible for some of the most heinous crimes ever committed against children. They're still protecting predators. How do they get to come in and say they're part of reconciliation until there is justice? So we need to address these. Again, this is not vindictiveness. This is about healing so that we can move forward with the incredible potential that I'm seeing in this young generation of Indigenous youth who are coming up. We give them the tools. They will transform this nation and make this nation the nation that we all believe it can be. And I challenge the church, you need to start standing up and speaking up and taking responsibility for the crimes that have happened and are happening.
Thank you. And finally, on to Elizabeth.
Thank you. I'm honored to represent and have represented in Parliament. And again, as you said at the beginning, running for re-election, so I'm not currently a parliamentarian, the traditional territory of Wasanac people. So the name of my riding, Saanich, Gulf Islands, is actually a mispronunciation of the nation on whose territory I'm honored to live and work. And I raise my hands to the Indigenous peoples of my territory. This language is called Senchothan. I say Haishka Siam, honor and thanks to all of my friends and colleagues here. My friend Miles Richardson, who was once president of the Council of the Haida Nation, defined reconciliation as when you see me as I see myself, and I see you as you see yourself. Now that's a very profound and much bigger than a political wish list. It's not a bunch of policies. It's really at the level of heart and soul, a shift. And Niigan Sinclair spoke to it so powerfully. This notion of, I hope I remembered it because I wasn't taking notes, that reconciliation involves being invited and included and Indigenous led, and that's absolutely right. So as a settler culture Canadian, and all of us here are settler culture Canadians, how do we be good allies? What do we do? I think it's profound as well that the spiritual frame of this conversation, we're in faithful election conversation, there's a worldview that comes from Indigenous spirituality. And Niigan went by it very quickly in terms of what he said about the thanks to the bear and the bear song of one of kinship. I have to say, as somebody who thought I was participating and really absorbing a lot of Indigenous ceremonies and welcoming ceremonies for decades, and it wasn't until one of my friend Adam Olson, who's my MLA actually, who's in Sartlip First Nation, explained that when you say all my relations, you're not just saying your auntie and your uncle and your dad and your granddad, you're saying the orca, the salmon, the trees, these are all our relations. And that relationship, if we're going to be looking at church, we do find it in Genesis 9 when the covenant where Noah says God says to Noah, to you and all the creatures there with you. And Noah didn't say, what? I'm just here by myself, just humans, nobody else here, right? There is a relationship. And our Judeo-Christian tradition has gotten in the way of some profound learnings. So we also have to call out racism when we see it. And I was just yesterday with a beautiful young woman named Augusta in Mission at the Mission Friendship Center. Just every time she goes in the bank, she's feeling ashamed because of the way she's treated. This is day-to-day racism in our society. I know I'm out of time, but it's a lot of work we have to do to be good allies.
Thank you so much, everybody, for your responses. Our second segment is going to be on the urgent climate crisis, and we'll be hearing from Flossie Baker, who is a faith sector organizer with Climate Emergency Unit, being interviewed by Carrie Munven, the Senior Policy Analyst for Citizens for Public Justice. So I'll pass the floor over to Flossie.
Hello, my name's Carrie Munven, and I'm with Citizens for Public Justice. I'm joined by Flossie Baker, who will share her perspective on what Canada's next federal government must do to address the climate emergency. Welcome, Flossie. Please take a moment to introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone. I am the faith sector organizer for the Climate Emergency Unit. And so it's my job to work with and support faith leaders across the country to bring the best of our traditions forward to meet this crisis.
So I just have a couple of questions. The first one, what climate-related issues should voters be aware of this election?
Well, we saw that with the heat dome this summer, large numbers of people, animals, birds have already begun dying. And in these next 4 critical years, every moment will count, every delay, every dollar. And so I say, look for a climate champion who is running near you and donate your time and your money to their campaign. Don't just wait for voting day. You will know if they're serious because they will tell the truth about the severity of the emergency and they'll be willing to spend what it takes.
And in terms of spending what it takes, what are the three things that Canada's next government needs to do to address the climate crisis?
Well, firstly, establish a climate emergency information board. We need the government to cover the climate crisis like it did the pandemic, to give us daily updates, to fill us in on their progress and where they're at with implementing their climate plans. Secondly, create a Youth Climate Corps, a program aimed at young people just finishing high school that invites them to spend 2 years, all expenses paid, volunteering on projects that speed up our transition away from fossil fuels. Not decades in the future, but now. And once they're done, they could be offered free post-secondary education or training. And third, end government subsidies to fossil fuels. That means immediately stopping subsidies to the oil and gas industry, cancelling all new fossil fuel projects, and announcing an immediate advertising ban on fossil fuels.
All right. Thank you for the opportunity to share a little bit about our climate change plan. And not to sound like a constant infomercial, but you can read our full plan at conservative.ca/plan. And I'd encourage those of you who are particularly interested in this area to read the climate change section. It's very robust and strong in terms of its effectiveness, and I think it corrects some of the flaws, the points of leakage in the existing government plan. So let me identify just a few of the particular differences. So one of them is border adjustments. The current approach to environment imposes costs and regulatory requirements on Canadian companies, but does not impose those same requirements on foreign companies that produce products outside of our borders and sell those products into Canada. And this is a big flaw because it incentivizes companies to move their operations outside of Canada, but to continue to produce at the same levels without improving their environmental standards and then sell back into a Canadian market. It doesn't help the environment and it's bad for the economy. Conservatives understand the global nature of the challenge we face in terms of climate change. And that's why we are calling for border adjustment tariffs, that there will be costs imposed on foreign companies that offset the additional costs that are applied to Canadian producers. So good for the environment, good for the economy. And one innovative idea in our plan is the idea of carbon savings accounts. So one of the biggest challenges I hear from many individuals seeking to reduce their environmental footprint is the cost for them of adaptation. Yes, it may be in the long run better for you in terms of cost as well as energy consumption if you make certain retrofits to your home or you add solar panels, but those adaptations cost money up front. And for many folks, they can't afford that. So conservative proposals involve giving all of the money collected through a point of sale carbon price directly back to individuals in a carbon savings account that they can use to address costs of adaptation. So this plan achieves environmental improvements on both sides of that plan. It introduces that aspect of a carbon price, but it also gives people the tools and resources to make adaptations. I want to as well just touch on the issue of unsafe plastic disposals. I think this is very important as well. In this Parliament, Conservatives put forward a private member's bill to ban the export of plastic waste. This was to address the fact that much of our ocean plastic comes from countries who don't have the same standards for managing that waste. We need to promote the circular economy in terms of plastic recycling and reuse. I think there's a lot of opportunities there, which is economically and environmentally why we took this step of proposing to ban the export of plastic waste. Unfortunately, Liberals voted against that bill, but we want to bring it in as a government bill if we have an opportunity. Thank you.
And we'll go next to Charlie.
Thank you so much. This is the question of the time right now. The planet is on fire. To see the Arctic on fire, to see Australia on fire, to see large sections of the West and Northern Ontario burning. What we've done in Parliament year in, year out since I've been elected is make great promises, and year in, year out, Canada and the various Conservative and Liberal governments have continued to put heavy subsidies into oil and gas and not gotten serious about alternatives. And the future is here and it is upon us. When I talk with young people, The sense that they don't believe that there will be a world for them is very real. And that is because the climate crisis is moving closer and closer, and we have run out of time in terms of action. So we need to do a number of steps. Canada in 2020 gave $18 billion in subsidies to oil and gas in Canada. We are the country that leads the G7 in the highest emissions. We'd probably talk more than any other country about how we're going to get better, but we get worse. We're like an addict that needs to go cold turkey on this. So imagine what would happen if we immediately cut that $18 billion and put that into alternatives. And the alternatives are essential because we can't leave regions of our country behind. I come from a resource sector. I know what it's like when a community is hit with shutdowns. When I was in Alberta the last time, I was meeting with energy workers who are retraining themselves, who tell me, and I've learned this from elsewhere, the #1 spot for an alternate economy in the world, an alternate energy economy, is Central South Alberta, Saskatchewan. We need to be diversifying so that we can deal with the changes that are coming very quickly. We need to establish a carbon budget by sectors. That's what's been done in the United Kingdom, where we can actually target where the high emissions are and find a way to get it down. And we have to say, we're going to get 50% reduction by 2030. That has to be a hard target, a hard goal. Part of what we are going to do as well is to have a climate emergency committee at Cabinet, so that the issue of the climate crisis is first and foremost in all our thinking, in all our development, in all the infrastructure money that we're spending.
Thank you, Charlie. And over to Elizabeth.
Thank you. Just trying to get my timer on so I don't go over. This is obviously the issue, as Charlie just said, of our time. We are in a climate emergency. I was just checking because we now have a website in British Columbia. You can look up BC wildfires of note, and we get wildfire reports. We get smoke reports, air quality reports, the way we used to get, it's going to be a sunny day. You now get to know ahead of time. You're not going to be able to breathe outside. We now have still, British Columbia is on fire. We have 15 wildfires of note. Just one of them is over 80,000 hectares and burning out of control. This climate emergency hit close to home for us. My husband's family farm is in Ashcroft, BC, in the interior. The temperature here in Ashcroft hit 50 degrees Celsius during the heat dome. My youngest stepdaughter, who was living on the farm at the time, got such severe heat stroke that she nearly died. Nearly 600 British Columbians died in a 4-day period. Preventable deaths because of the heat dome, because of global warming, because of profligate use of fossil fuels, and a refusal to acknowledge that this transition off fossil fuels is not a project of decades. It has to be rapid. We have to be serious about the climate emergency. I really appreciate Flossie and the conversation that Carrie had, that where Flossie works, the climate emergency unit involves Seth Klein, who wrote A Good War. I encourage people to find the climate emergency unit's very short video on the climate emergency and what it looks like. We need to rally in a whole of government approach, which we have not yet seen. We need to rally as if we were fighting fascism, as my parents' generation did in the Second World War. All hands on deck. And that means that none of the other parties, and I don't want it to sound partisan, but only the Green Party has a target for reducing greenhouse gases that is consistent with what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change requires, based on not politics, but the physics of our global atmosphere. We are running perilously close to tipping points, points of no return, with irreversible, self-accelerating global warming, which, yes, will thaw permafrost and release more greenhouse gases. Yes, will eliminate Arctic ice, and we have a watery North Pole at least some of every year. This is not something that we can afford to kick down the road, and we must take it seriously, just as C.D. Howe did in the Second World War, when someone said the costs of this war effort are piling up, and he said, if we don't win the war, nothing else matters. That's where we are on the climate crisis.
And finally, over to you, John. Thank you, Elizabeth, for your comments.
Thank you. I find that we are uniquely good at describing the problem, but when it comes to solutions, maybe not so good. In 2008, I ran with Stéphane Dion on the Green Shift platform, and we were clobbered. The Conservatives ran us into the ground on, in particular, Jason Kenney was quite good at saying this is going to be a tax on everything. And it took quite a number of years before people came around to the notion of pricing carbon. So when we became government in 2015, that was sort of a job, because if you price carbon, you're going to get some change in behavior. And so the Prime Minister and the Cabinet fought that all the way through to the Supreme Court of Canada on the question of whether it could be that the federal government could actually impose a price on carbon, and ultimately won the case in spite of the opposition of 4 of the premiers in particular. Having done that, we are now pricing carbon. And that system is now in place with offsets for people who don't have significant income. And as when they file their income tax, they can claim a credit. So that fight is actually on its way. And with that fight, you can start to escalate the pricing of carbon so that you escalate the change behavior, because everyone should be looking in the mirror, because the problem is ourselves. So that's a rather, I think, a very significant accomplishment on the part of this government, is to start pricing carbon. The second thing is to unleash the private sector. I know to some years, that's a terrible thing, but if governments talk in billions, private sectors talk in trillions. And there is a significant initiative on the part of the private sector to shift investments into the green economy, and to make the not green economy far more expensive. That in turn will create an energy source that'll be profoundly more green, and will create it far more quickly than any government can ever hope to do.
Thank you all for your comments and responses. Our third segment is on poverty and inequality, and we will be hearing from Natalie Appleyard, who is a socioeconomic policy analyst for Citizens for Public Justice, being interviewed by Joe Gunn, the executive director of Sans Blabla, a Voice for Justice. And so I'll pass the floor over to Natalie and Joe.
My name is Joe Gunn. I live in Ottawa and work at the Sans Blabla, a Voice for Justice. And I'm with Natalie Appleyard, who is the socioeconomic policy analyst at Citizens for Public Justice. So Natalie, what is poverty and inequality? What do they look like in Canada today?
When we talk about poverty in a country as rich as Canada, it's not just about not having enough food, not having a home, or having to slave away at multiple part-time jobs just to make ends meet. These are all true, of course, but it's the inequality that makes poverty in Canada even more cruel and persistent. Poverty not only deprives people of their basic needs, but it also prevents them from accessing the kinds of opportunities that everyone else considers to be universal. So I think, for example, of kids I used to teach, coming to school hungry, living in a 1-bedroom apartment with 10 people maybe, compared to those kids who were chatting about their ski trips that weekend. They all had access to the same publicly funded school system, but their opportunities for educational success were worlds apart. So poverty is not just about falling on hard times. It's not about personal failure. It's actually a failure of our society to ensure that resources, opportunities, and power are equitably shared in a way that allows all people to flourish, and not only those who belong to certain groups.
So has the situation of poverty and inequality changed during this pandemic?
Well, even before the pandemic, 1 in 8 families in Canada were already struggling to put food on the table, and about 6 million people were considered to be living in poverty. So to no one's surprise, the same folks who were already disproportionately impacted by poverty were also at greatest risk in terms of the health and economic impacts of the pandemic. So while the virus itself doesn't discriminate by race or gender or immigration status, for example, our laws and social safety net do. And that puts folks who are Indigenous, Black, disabled, women or gender nonconforming, LGBTQ, or precariously employed at much higher risk of both contracting the virus and falling into poverty. So the pandemic exacerbated these existing inequalities and confronted us with the inadequacy of our social safety net.
What should voters do? What 3 things could we demand of candidates in this election to address poverty and inequality?
I would like to see all parties work together to implement a basic income guarantee so that all people can meet their basic needs without having to beg, perform, or justify their need or worth. We also need a government that will commit to addressing the housing crisis that began with federal divestments in the 80s, and prior to that, the forced relocation of Indigenous peoples. So I'd like to see the government invest in the creation of at least 300,000 deeply affordable co-op and not-for-profit housing spaces within the next decade, and implement minimum standards for developers and landlords to promote and protect affordable housing. And then third, to fund these and other investments and to distribute wealth more equally, we need to raise taxes and close loopholes for wealthy individuals and corporations to build a more just society.
And this time we'll start off first with the NDP and go over to Charlie.
Well, thank you very much for that discussion. One thing we learned from COVID is COVID has been a very hard and strict teacher, and COVID has exposed many of the myths and failings that we tell ourselves about Canada, our inability to produce our own PPE, the fact that we'd sold off, a world-class vaccine system to the private sector because we were told private sector is going to do it better. The fact that within 3 weeks of the pandemic hitting, millions of Canadians couldn't pay their own rent. The level of precarity that ordinary families are living with is the result of years of this deregulation, this liberal conservative neoliberal vision of letting companies do what they want in terms of undermining basic employee rights. We fought to get CERB put in place because the Liberals were talking about EI. Well, 60% of the people don't qualify for EI because it's not a system that actually responds to many people who are in a perpetual gig economy. So we have to deal with the inequities of precarious work. We have to start dealing with the fact that people go to work and are told, oh no, you're now an intern. You're going to work for us for free to get experience. These kind of unfair situations where students come out with $20,000, $40,000, $60,000 worth of debt and interest is being charged on it. We have to say that if we're going to talk about lifelong learning opportunities, we can't be talking about lifelong debt. We New Democrats are going to tackle the student debt issue, talk about $20,000 debt forgiveness right off the top, and the interest on student loans to make that a priority. The housing crisis. The fact that we remember when Paul Martin told us, the private sector will step up, let them do their job. Well, they didn't do the job. And we've seen endless speculation in the real estate market where people now, even middle-class jobs, cannot get a house. So we have to deal with that. And we have to deal with the issue of a basic income for people who've fallen through the cracks. They deserve to live in dignity. We will institute a basic income to ensure that everyone can live in dignity in this country.
Thank you, Charlie. And we'll go next to Elizabeth.
Thank you. And I'm proud of the fact that the Green Party of Canada, before I became a member, so it was a long, long time ago, has had a policy in favor of a guaranteed livable income. And I couldn't be more thrilled, but to see more and more parties and individual members of Parliament take up this very important major change in our social safety net. It's overdue. And I think COVID and the use of CERB has really made people look at it and say, look, we can do this. We can't afford poverty, actually. We can't afford to have people whose life chances, as we were just hearing, if you're in school and you don't have the same opportunities as every other kid, you feel that very acutely. And a lot of the recent studies that we talk about in our anti-poverty caucus, which some of you who are on this call as NGOs have attended, we've got very strong evidence that a livable income, a guaranteed livable income, improves the quality of life for all Canadians, even those who are not in acute poverty right now. It is, the number one social determinant of health is poverty. We can't afford poverty, and we know how, and we could make this shift. We've seen now how CERB rolled out so quickly, and the Parliamentary Budget Office said, a guaranteed livable income would have addressed all those problems. And yes, it will be expensive, but it will save in all kinds of other areas, including our healthcare system, our correctional system. It's not something that we should accept, that there are such grave inequities between and among us as a people. As a wealthy, industrialized society, we can afford to eliminate poverty, and I'd make the case that we can't afford not to. So I think those are my comments on this. It's just urgent that we deal with housing, that we deal with life chances, early childhood education. I'm so glad to see that that's coming back. We almost had it in 2005 and lost it. Now we've got a chance to nail that down. Every child in Canada and our Indigenous children deserves, what Cindy Blackstock has exposed over and over again in terms of those gaps. We can close all those gaps and make sure that every Canadian has equal opportunities in our society to be able to have the best quality of life and contribute fully as active citizens.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And we'll go to John next.
I have the good fortune of representing a riding called Scarborough-Guildwood. Scarborough-Guildwood is the _1 riding in all of Canada for the recipient, as a recipient of the Canada Child Benefit, which I think is an underappreciated but massively important initiative on the part of this government, on the part of the Liberal government. In my particular case, in the case of my riding, that means in excess of $100 million a year into the riding, into the hands of the families who will actually spend the money in the riding. I think it's an economic multiplier that is underappreciated and understudied. And for those who are poverty advocates, I would encourage people to actually pursue this as a point of public policy, to look at the economic multiplier of putting money, not tax credits, not all these other fancy this or that's, putting money into the hands of families in particular, particularly families that are economically challenged. Second point is that the government of Canada essentially only has one way to raise money, and that's the tax system. Again, in the last mandate, we raised the rates on the higher income earners, and we reduced rates on the lower income earners, again, over the protests of many, and ultimately succeeded in that. Whoever pointed out that the pandemic has exposed us in a woeful fashion is absolutely correct. We did produce the program on CERB. Again, Scarborough-Guildwood in particular was a significant recipient of that CERB money and kept many people afloat. It's now being transitioned into an EI program with, if you will, expanded eligibility. These are very significant initiatives. And finally, I'll end on I've been cursed to be in the Department of Finance for a little too long at times. And the question that the mandarins in the Department of Finance will ask was, okay, if you want a guaranteed income, which I think in theory sounds like a good idea, what programs are you going to give up? And where is the revenue going to come from? So those are the really, really difficult questions. And I encourage those who are interested to think about that very deeply.
Thank you, John. And finally, we'll move to Garnett.
Well, thank you so much. So I care a lot about poverty because all of us on this call care a lot about poverty. I think we should also reflect prudently on the principle that the road to hell is paved with good intentions sometimes. So where are we at right now in terms of our fiscal situation as a country? Well, we're seeing massive inflation. the government has run up more debt in the last 6 years than in the entire country's history up until 2015, and that's through many previous national crises. This is leading to inflation. Inflation is a transfer of wealth from those who rely on wages to wealthy bondholders. Inflation exacerbates inequality. And so I think we have to be very careful when people talk about government spending that is going to be driven by inflation and further drive up inequality. I think we also have to be careful just to recognize the reality that the question referred to cuts that happened in the 90s under a Liberal government. That happened in a context when our public finances overall were in an extremely precarious situation. And with the kind of precarity of national public finance that we're in, we risk getting to a point where cuts have to be made, and dramatic cuts made quickly, regardless of who's in power, whether we like it or not. So we want to avoid that. And I think we need prudent policies that fight poverty, that fight inequality while tending to our public finances. I think that's the approach we offer. So our conservative plan this time, it is interventionist, but it is interventionist in a way that promotes supporting people to get back to work. So we've introduced dramatic new financial credits, an offer to pay the up to half of the salaries of new hires for 6 months to help people get back to work. So subsidizing employers getting more people into work, recognizing the dignity of work, recognizing that human well-being and happiness doesn't just come from having money, although having the financial resources you need is important, but having opportunities to work for all available to all Canadians, and therefore, also have your needs taken care of is a critically important and valuable combination. When it comes to housing, the government has not done nearly enough to look square in the face the fact that a big part of the housing cost problem is supply. We need a dramatic increase in the supply of housing. And we have a plan to open up federal lands to incentivize the construction of more rental housing to increase the availability of housing supply. That will be a key driver of people being able to find affordable housing. We need an inclusive economy where everyone can work and where workers have a voice, which is why we proposed dramatic reforms on workplace democracy, on protecting gig workers. I agree very much with Charlie in terms of his identification of the problem around this. I think our platform has been recognized as the best platform for protecting the rights of labor, strengthening workplace democracy, protecting gig workers. We need to provide employment for all in an inclusive economy, and we need to ensure that in that context of that employment, workers have a voice. Thanks.
Thank you all for your responses. We've made it to our final segment of the town hall today, and we'll be discussing xenophobia, including racial and religious intolerance. We'll hear from Akaash Maharaj, who is the former Chief Executive Officer of the Mosaic Institute, being interviewed by Jeff Cameron, the Director of the Office of Public Affairs for the Baha'i Community of Canada. So I'll pass it off to Akaash and Jeff.
My name is Jeffrey Cameron. I serve as Director of the Office of Public Affairs for the Baha'i Community of Canada. And I'm joined today by Akaash Maharaj to talk about the challenge of addressing xenophobia and racial and religious intolerance in Canadian society. Perhaps before we begin, Akaash, you could briefly introduce yourself.
As Jeff has said, my name is Akaash Maharaj. Much of my life's work has been in peace and international conflict resolution. If I have a personal calling, I hope it is this. It's work that I believe goes to the heart of my identity as a Canadian, because our country is built, howsoever imperfectly, on the ideals of inclusion and pluralism.
What do you think are the main issues that voters should be aware of in relation to the challenge of xenophobia in Canadian society in the context of this upcoming election?
First, xenophobia and intolerance are not only attacks on vulnerable members of Canadian society, they are in a very real way attacks against all of us, because they are attacks on the very identity of our country. Second, bigotry is a kind of plague. When it is allowed to fester, it spreads from person to person, from community to community, ultimately sparing no one. If we sit on our hands as hate comes for our neighbors, hate will inevitably come for us. And third, as Canadians, I think we have to banish any notion that it could never happen here. That is a comforting self-deception that we are too apt to tell ourselves, to feel superior to other societies, and to justify averting our eyes from our own evils. We have to be willing to see our demons before we can summon the strength to defeat them.
Now, this problem that you've described is one that is not only a challenge at a social level, it is also, in a way, a public policy challenge. So I want to ask you, what are 3 things you'd like to see Canada's next government do to address xenophobia, including racial and religious intolerance?
Perhaps more than anything else, I would like to see a government that is willing to act and not merely emote about combating xenophobia, religious intolerance, and racism. In my lifetime, I have seen tolerance and anti-racism become part of the mainstream parlance of every major political party. Yet, I have also seen the gap between words and deeds grow into something of a yawning chasm. Political figures of all stripes have too often spoken the language of anti-bigotry to create the illusion that they are acting on it. They have too often embraced loud symbolism to distract us from the fact that they have quietly rejected meaningful substance. So I would like to see the next government offer not only a set of commitments in its first speech from the throne, but also a timetable for their implementation to be reviewed annually by Parliament. I would like to see a government that is prepared to be judged by its deeds and not just by its words. Secondly, I think that governments and political parties must be willing to lead by example before they lead by legislation. Combating xenophobia and religious intolerance are a question not only of creating sound laws, but also of creating sound political and social norms. Political parties, political actors have an enormous amount of power as social leaders. And so I would like to see what party leaders will do as leaders of their parties and not just as leaders of governments to banish racism, xenophobia, and religious intolerance from their own parties. Before I'm prepared to believe as an individual that a person is going to legislate against these things as Prime Minister, I must first see that he or she was willing to act against these impulses in his or her own party, where, quite frankly, they have a great deal more power, still more power than they do as head of government. Finally, it will not surprise you, given my background, that I would like to see Canada take a principled foreign policy, and one where embedded in our objectives as a country is combating racism and anti-religious intolerance around the world. We are fundamentally a world-facing country, a country whose populations come from every corner of the world. And as a result, our ability to model our own society hinges more than most states on our ability to project our values into the world at large. I would like, therefore, to see the next government set a set of objectives and actually implement the objectives to abate religious intolerance around the world. And in doing so, I think we will help to realize those values in Canada as well. As a Canadian, as a young Canadian, I was most proud of my country's foreign policy when it took a leadership role in combating apartheid in South Africa. I think that made South Africa a better place, it made the world a better place, and I know it made Canada a better place. I yearn for a return to those days.
And for our final segment, we'll start off first with Elizabeth.
I have to thank Akaash for those powerful words. We have to acknowledge, which is hard, and of course this comes through in many of the themes we've talked about. You have to start with truth before you get to reconciliation. You have to acknowledge and be able to look yourself in the mirror and see the real problems before you can make the changes that are required. And we do emote in Parliament. My goodness, we do. We stand up and denounce racism and transphobia and anti-Semitism and anti-Chinese racism and Indigenous racism. Reflecting on the conversation I was having that I mentioned at the Mission Friendship Center this week, for that young woman to feel that when she went in the bank, she's being judged. Where she get that check? Why is she cashing that check? And it immediately reminded me of the incident that wasn't that long ago in Vancouver at a Bank of Montreal, where an Indigenous grandfather brought his granddaughter in at 9 years old, I think she was, to help her know how to open a bank account for herself. And they ended up in separate police cars, handcuffed, because the Bank of Montreal employees had obviously ignorance, racism, but the police showed up and put a grandfather in a separate police car. These are not historic wrongs. They are daily wrongs. And the largest form of racism, just as a matter of population and as a matter of law, that the Indian Act is on the books, which is a racist piece of legislation. We need to deal with anti-Indigenous racism. And I think that starts with going through the institutions where racism is the most dangerous. And that's where people through their jobs carry guns. So I want to go through the military and the police forces and actually go through social media profiles. I think we need to have a conscious effort of government to root out white supremacists. This is a term I never thought would be coming to the fore again, or a movement, but clearly it is a movement, and it is in our face. And in Fairy Creek, where the old growth protesters have been, it's clear that the RCMP are more violent in arresting young Indigenous people. This needs to be confronted. It's clear that in so-called wellness checks, when a young, beautiful Nuu-chah-nulth woman like Chantal Moore ends up being shot 5 times because an Edmundston city police officer didn't, claims, by the way, that she had a knife in her hands, but the forensics don't back that up. We need to actually not let these incidents that are daily news stories go by without insisting that we get to the truth. Because without the truth of the inherent racism in our society, anti-Black, anti-Asian, anti-Indigenous, anti-Semitism, we can't confront it, and we can't take the real steps that Akaash reminds us we must take, including through our foreign policy.
Thank you, Elizabeth. We'll go next to John.
I have again, the honor of representing Scarborough-Guildwood, which is probably the most racial, or most racialized, most religiously diverse, ethnically diverse, name whatever category you wish to name, in the country. I'm sure I might be challenged by a few others, but so we live and breathe these issues of the variety of phobias and intolerance and racism, et cetera, et cetera. And as a practicing politician, one of the areas that I find most vexing and most discouraging is the way in which, and this picks up on Akaash's foreign policy issue, is the way the diaspora communities react to events around the world. So in my particular case, I have a great number of Indians, and I have significant Muslim Indian population, significant Hindu population, and a less significant Sikh population. And whenever anything happens in India done by Prime Minister Modi, we seem to have this vicarious way in which we live out these challenges, and these challenges in turn lead to hardening of the differences among Canadians of Indian descent. And that's, and I frankly don't know what the answer is to that. We had one of the most discouraging elements was the recent conflict in Israel and Palestine, and that played out in a very discouraging aspect. Interestingly, one of the things I thought that the Public Safety Committee did, which was quite useful, was to call together those who were most vocal about Islamophobia and those who were most vocal about anti-Semitism. And for the first 10 minutes on each side, they presented their responses. And then after about 20 minutes, they started to realize that these are different sides of the same coin, or maybe it is the same coin. And by the end of the session, there was actually, not only were they speaking to each other by their first names, but there was actually some meeting of minds on what could be done with both Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. I use that as an example of the bully pulpit that is afforded to each and every one of us to bring some form of reconciliation, understanding, dialogue among those who wish to create divisions among we as Canadians. So I take some encouragement from that, and I hope that as we go forward, these issues will be a little bit more systematically addressed.
Thank you, John. And over to Garnett.
Well, thank you. This is a great question, a very broad question, one that, as the grandson of a Holocaust survivor, I have a great deal of personal investment in. Let me start on the international side. And I do think it's important that the question recognize some of these interconnections between intolerance internationally and domestically. Sometimes we have messages that are projected internationally that have an impact on domestic issues of intolerance and violence as well. I think our parliament, I wouldn't say the government respectfully, but I would say our parliament has really led on international human rights issues through, for instance, the Uyghur genocide motion that Conservatives put forward, recognizing the Uyghur genocide. The cabinet abstained, but backbench members of the government, as well as all other parties, supported that motion. And we need to address the fact that we have a contemporary genocide going on in the world's second largest economy, second most powerful country. And there are many leading voices in Canada that think we should just, look the other way and focus on the economy, and that's just dead wrong. And our platform includes a very strong human rights policy, which includes a commitment to dramatic reform to supply chain legislation. Actually, something that John McKay has been working on for a long time, but his government hasn't actioned, unfortunately. And our party has.
It is in our platform, though, Garnett.
Yeah. Well, our party wants to take the opportunity that was missed by the Liberals and adopt this good idea from John. And I always tease him that he should be in our caucus. But anyways, on the domestic front, look, we need to make clear statements announcing intolerance in every case. And by the way, that includes in the case of violence against churches and Christians. We've had a spate of violence targeting churches, the burning down of a Coptic church in Vancouver, for example. And sadly, there's been no statements from the government. I think the Prime Minister responded to one question on that. We need to be consistent. It's not about saying we only respond in one case or only another case. We need to have strong condemnation of violence against any faith community, against any minority community, as well as attacks against property that can well lead to attacks against individuals. We need to clearly criminalize incitement to violence, and our platform calls for that, clear criminalization of any incitement to violence, including online. I think the government needs to do a better job of leading by example through policies to promote equality in procurement and in the public service. For this issue of leading by example, if we're going to talk about issues of systemic racism and intolerance in other parts of society, the government needs to clean up its act in terms of ensuring our public service is actually representative of the ethnocultural and religious diversity of this country, and that we are setting targets and meeting targets for procurement from Indigenous-owned, Black-owned, and other minority-owned businesses that often do have the best products but may not have the pre-existing connections. We need reforms at the CRA. We need our platform calls for revision of direction and control, the kind of neo-colonial regulations and development assistance that really limit partnerships with other countries around the world, and other reforms to CRA that Muslim groups, for instance, have raised about the targeting of Muslim charities. Many other issues I could talk about, and I'm sorry to be a little bit over time, but there are many concrete proposals on these and other issues at conservative.ca/plan. And come on over, John.
And finally, over to you, Charlie, for the NDP.
Well, thank you so much. We are the one party with a racialized leader, and Jagmeet Singh has spent his life fighting racism. And part of what's really important about that is that the New Democratic Party, in terms of what we've been asked about what parties will do, we have actually instituted policies to prioritize candidates who come from minority communities, racialized communities, Indigenous, the queer community, who often don't get advanced in the old white guy politics world. And these voices will change Canada for the better. Certainly the issue of online hate has to be addressed, and the incitement to hate. One of the things that we've seen with COVID is this rise of virulent conspiracy theory and threat that is really, I think, a toxic presence in the Canadian civil discourse that has to be dealt with. And we remember also, though, how it can be used for political manipulation. Remember in 2015 when the Conservatives had their snitch line about calling out your Muslim neighbors, when the Bloc had ads about Sharia law. The hate that is used for promotion has to be called out and has to be stopped. We need to deal with issues right now in terms of the rise of anti-Semitism in Canada. That's always, I think, a sign of of a breakdown in civil discourse. Of course, the huge power imbalance that exists in Indigenous communities and the racism that's faced by our First People is one of the fundamental issues Canada must address. But I'd like to end this on a positive note. Here in Northern Ontario, in Northern Canada, the promotion of immigration, we see such possibilities of particularly families coming from the global south, francophone immigration from Africa. The transformation of northern and rural communities by immigration is an exciting process. And for that, it means that all our communities learn to be a lot more open and learn to be a lot more embracing. And that change, I think, is the magic of Canada, the ability of people like my family who came as working class immigrants to this country to build, to work together, to learn from one another, to build a nation of tolerance. That is the goal that Canadians aspire to, and we must all, across party lines, make that happen.
Thank you all for your responses. I saw Elizabeth's hand go up, and I just want to quickly make a comment that Anime Paul is also a racialized leader of the Green Party.
Oh, sorry, I forgot
and
that.
Elizabeth
I keep thinking it's Elizabeth because Elizabeth was on. I keep thinking of her, so sorry about that.
No worries. And Elizabeth just reminding that Anime is the first Black leader of any party and second Jewish leader as a side note as well. Thank you all so much for your responses. We'll now move for the next little bit to some questions from the audience for any of you. So I'll ask that maybe the easiest thing to do would be if you'd like to answer the question, either just to physically raise your hand or let me know in some type of way, and we'll call on you to go one after another. So the first question that we have is, what does Indigenous self-determination mean to you? And what role should the federal government play in promoting Indigenous self-determination? Elizabeth.
Thank you. Indigenous self-determination means what it sounds like. It actually means that Indigenous nations and peoples in this country, whether First Nations, Métis, or Inuit, have the right to control their destiny. This is absolutely fundamental to sustainable development. It's essential in climate justice. And in the context of the Canadian Constitution, even before adopting the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, we've been guided by the Supreme Court of Canada in case after case, from Delgamuukw to Haida to Chilcotin, that when Indigenous people, the title to land means, as former Supreme Court Chief Justice Beverly McLaughlin wrote in Chilcotin, title is title is title. An Indigenous title, unlike our fee simple European model, is genius, is intergenerational and collective, which is also a worldview shift, such as Niigan Sinclair was talking to us about earlier. So getting rid of the Indian Act is not going to be an easy thing. Some First Nations may choose to continue with a system of governance that they've grown used to. Other Indigenous communities and nations where the hereditary forms of government, matriarchies, matrilineal societies, consensus-based decision-making as opposed to holding elections every 2 years for chief and council, each of these traditional communities should have the right, and do under our Constitution, I believe, have the right already to choose how they are governed. It's in conflict with the Indian Act. Fixing that is going to be, as my friend Jody Wilson-Raybould always said, it's going to be messy. It's a long process, but Indigenous self-determination means exactly that. And it starts from a place of nation to nation respect. And that's something that we as parliamentarians should exercise every day in how we relate to the Indigenous nations, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, on whose land we reside.
Thank you, Elizabeth. If any of the other candidates want to answer the question, you're welcome to. Otherwise, we'll jump to the next. Garnett, go ahead.
Yeah, well, and maybe just to develop the point that Elizabeth made, from my perspective, I think one of the issues we have in the whole discussion around Indigenous rights in Canada is that once you're expressing empathy and solidarity, everybody agrees with you. When you start to propose changes to existing structures that everybody realizes needs to be changed, that's where it inevitably becomes controversial. And that's where I think we do need political courage, is to talk about, how do we engage Indigenous Canadians and support efforts to address address some of these fundamental injustices through structural changes. And I think from my perspective, this needs to include supporting economic development. It needs to include support for self-determination. It needs to include flexibility, recognizing, as Elizabeth said, there may be different models pursued by different communities. It also means supporting the rights of communities to say yes to development and to have a process by which they say yes to development, and recognizing that colonialism can take the form of both imposing a yes and imposing a no on communities. So there's a lot of work that's required, and it requires us to sort of go beyond just the expressions of solidarity, which are right and necessary, but relatively easy, and go on to proposing the kind of concrete changes, some of which our platform is talking about, those constructive changes that will really action the kind of self-determination that we've had talked about for the last 6 years, but not seen much done on.
Thank you, Garnett. And we'll go over to John. I see your hand.
Well, just to join issue here a little bit, because Elizabeth does raise a significant issue of self-determination, but I guess it's the old property lawyer in me. Security of tenure is actually the genius of English language law, and security of tenure means that this is the property is good against everyone, including the Crown. And based upon that, you can use your property to develop, put a house on it or do other business with it or whatever. And therefore you open up and access all kinds of money that allows you to develop the property. Absent that kind of a system, maybe there's other systems, I don't know what they might be, but absent that kind of system, you essentially shut yourself out of the economic prosperity of the society. And so, for those nations who wish to adopt an alternate system, that may be perfectly acceptable, but it may also have consequences, intended or unintended.
Thank you, John. Just wanted to check if, I don't see Charlie there anymore, actually. But if he wanted to answer, maybe we'll just move to the next question then. So the next question we have for each of you is, how does your party see the connection between a guaranteed livable income, the climate crisis, and a new green economy? And how would you advocate for it if elected? Would anyone prefer to start? Elizabeth, go ahead.
I'm terrible at putting my hand up at everything. Everybody's used to me. Look, the climate crisis can't be solved if we continue the same model of exploitation, colonialism, and large gaps between the wealthiest and the poorest. I mean, that was one of my friends in the French Green Party explained to me some time ago that the Yellow Vest movement was not people who opposed climate action. They actually wanted climate action, but they did not like that Emmanuel Macron created one set of rules for his rich friends, and that the working people in the banlieue, the far-flung areas outside of big cities, had to pay increasingly onerous prices to get to work. So you can't solve the climate crisis without solving the problems of inequity and poverty. So they go together. And so solving the climate crisis and turning the page on our pre-COVID world and deciding that we really are at a hinge moment in history, we can redefine how our societies work. We can say that we're eliminating poverty at the same time that we stop being dependent on fossil fuels and embrace energy sources that don't threaten to destroy our children's futures. And I'm not speaking in hyperbole or hyperbolic terms. What we know from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change most recent report, as the UN Secretary General said, it's code red for humanity. We are for the first time looking at scientific warnings that we could actually make the planet unlivable. I am terrified that that's exactly where we are. But these things work together: equity, ending poverty, climate justice, and real meaningful climate action. And just a parenthetical note, because my friend John McKay said earlier, look, this is all of us that are responsible for this. I think it's important for people to think about that through the whole pandemic of COVID, through all of 2020, with people all around the world not driving and all around the world not flying, Guess what? It only reduced global emissions by 8% compared to 2019. So we've been told for too long that this is on us as individuals. It's large polluters, large corporations, and the failure of governments to do what we did when we banned lead in gasoline, banned perchloroethylene in our dry cleaners, banned ozone depleting substances. We need to ban the emissions that are threatening our very survival.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Then I'll go over to John.
I just wanted to make a couple of comments on guaranteed income. For some of us in the Liberal caucus, this is an attractive idea. It's in part an attractive idea because it gets money into the hands of those who need it the most efficiently, and that is actually I think in some respects the most attractive argument to a guaranteed income of some kind or another. It is not without consequences. So what I've noticed, the most enthusiastic people about this don't want to simultaneously give up some cherished social programs that they consider to be, if you will, a rock solid element of being a Canadian. But something has to give here, and I don't hear a lot of conversation about that. The other issue is what are the social consequences, and in fact the consequences on the job market for somebody who receives a guaranteed income. I know certain side of the argument will say there will be no consequence, and others will say, hold on here. The second, and then to link it into the climate change, and again the system under which we live, namely kind of a quasi-capitalist system. Basically what you're doing with the pricing of carbon is you're saying the free dumping exercise is over, people, and whether it's individuals who do take responsibility, like I disagree with my good friend Elizabeth on that, and the corporations who are also equally responsible. But if you're polluting either air or water, you're now got to pay. And I think the system recognizing that we can't carry on the way we carry on. You can't get this freebie and still produce a product at the expense of us all. So it's in some respects it's an equity driving to price carbon in a vigorous fashion and price carbon right across the board.
Thank you, John. Garnett, go ahead.
Yeah, so I do not support the proposed reform to go to kind of a guaranteed minimum income type of structure. I think it ignores the basic principle of social support that that the equal treatment of those who are in unequal pre-existing situations is not equality. We are in the process of continually developing and seeking to reform and strengthen a social safety structure that identifies particular needs and supports people in the realization of those needs. And it's far from perfect. There's more work that needs to be done. But these kinds of across the board blanket policies are less likely to, from my perspective, give the support to those who need it, who may need more support because of the particulars of their situation, and in particular to give people the kinds of support that might allow them to transition out of whatever in their situation has led them to require government support in the first place. So, I think those who say, well, we're going to get rid of all existing supports and replace them with a UBI type structure, well, you're going to actually leave a lot more people behind potentially. And those who say, well, we're just going to do this on top of the existing system, well, you can't pay people enough to compensate them for the costs of inflation that are going to be resulting from piling a whole bunch more permanent new spending on top of the already existing situations. I think it was Benjamin Disraeli who said famously that the facts of life are conservative. And I think we're all idealistic. We all want to make a difference and help people in vulnerable situations. And I think we have to be realistic about maximizing the positive impact in the context of the resources that we have. So I think we can do better. I think we can reform social programs. I think we can target support to those in need, as our platform does. But I do not think a UBI is the way to do it.
Thank you all for your comments and responses. We're at 1:30 now, so we have just hit our time. I appreciate all of you taking the time to join us today. I'm just going to quickly pass it over back to John for some final closing comments, and thank you again for joining us.
Great, thank you very much, Sarisha, and my apologies. I know there's lots of people who still have questions for the candidates, but I think you'd agree we should respect their time during such a very, very busy period. But we certainly encourage you to find your local candidates and engage them in this important discussion and pose your questions to them. So as Sarisha said, this brings a close to today's program. And I just want to quickly offer a few words of thanks. First of all, to our candidates for taking time out of, as I said, a very, very busy schedule to come speak with us today. To Sarisha for doing such a wonderful job as a moderator, to our experts and interviewers for setting the context, and of course, to all of you for joining us. As I mentioned at the beginning, we see this as the start of a process. We'll be making a recording of today's event available to all of you, as well as to our network of faith communities. And we encourage you to make use of it as you engage in deliberation over the election over the coming days, and certainly pass it on. So look for an email in the coming days with a link, and please make good use of this session. So once again, thank you for joining us for this important discussion designed to encourage people of faith to engage in our call to citizenship, and have a great rest of the day.